Hey everybody, and welcome back to my channel. This is the second episode of Illumination. It's Thursday, February the 7th, 2013. And as promised, we're going to continue to tackle the very basics of photography. Now, in the previous video, right here, we tackled some of the more basic things like camera operation or buttons, basic terminology. Now in the second part of this discussion, we're going to talk about some of the most basic camera settings. Which camera settings I'm going to be talking about? That's ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and white balance. Okay, so those four settings are in fact what control everything that has to do with your image. So it's pretty much well worth to learn it. Now it has to be said, all four of these settings have some effect on your image's exposure, save for one, that's white balance, that controls the color output. And they also have secondary attributes that you have to be very wary of, because these secondary attributes affect your image as well. So to start this discussion, let's go to ISO. Now ISO is actually a measure of how sensitive your sensor is to light exposure. Now what do I mean by how sensitive the photo sensor is to light exposure? Now think of it this way. Your sensor is a container of water, and the light is actually a stream of water. Now if you have a very high ISO or a very small container of water, let's take an example of a glass, so it would almost immediately fill up with water. Now that's good for one reason, because your sensor is more sensitive to light, but then there's also that secondary attribute that I was talking about earlier, and it affects how noisy your image eventually is, because the higher the ISO, typically the noisier the image is. So it really depends on how or what situation you're in. Very dark, very dark situations, very dark venues will demand that you use higher ISOs, and modern cameras are a miracle in this regard, because they have ISOs, high ISOs, which are so clean. I mean, the professional level all the way down to the consumer level, the high ISOs have been cleaning up consistently, so that's a good thing. So again, if you want to have a brighter image, increase your ISO, but that will also result in your photo having more noise. So brighter image, higher ISO, but also more noise. Next up, we'll talk about the shutter speed. Now the shutter speed is one of the most common things, or one of the easiest things to spot on your camera's viewfinder. It's the setting that dictates how quickly your sensor is allowed to be exposed to the light source. A higher number results in a shorter exposure, resulting in also a darker image. So the higher the number, the darker the image. It's kind of like the opposite of ISO. That number, that setting, usually you can find it on your camera, which reads out something like 1/80, 1/200, or something like that. It's a fraction. It's pretty easy to spot, and aside from it controlling the exposure, the secondary attribute of shutter speed controls the motion of your image. Now what do I mean by motion? So as an example, if I were to move my hand in front of this camera right now, if I had a very high shutter speed, my hand would be frozen wherever it would be frozen, like here maybe. Now since I do have the camera set right now to a very low shutter speed, if I move my hand quickly, it's more like a blur. Okay, so the lower your number, the blurrier your image tends to be as a result of motion. Okay, so again, higher number, darker image, but motion is frozen. The lower the number, the image is brighter, but motion is also blurred. Got that so far? Okay, now next up we'll talk about aperture. Now a lot of people disregard the aperture even though this is the one setting that they don't know they should be looking at. This is a setting that's going to help them achieve the photos they want to achieve. Your aperture, from the name itself, is actually the opening of the lens, or it's controlling how much light is being allowed to touch or to reach the sensor. Think of it sort of as a gatekeeper of your sensor. Now, the aperture dictates how big or how small the opening to your sensor is going to be, and it usually reads out, it's the number or the setting in your camera that reads out as f2.8, f4, f5.6, something to that effect. Okay, it's the one with the F. You could say it's the one that gives an F. Anyway, moving on. The way it works is that the smaller the number, the brighter the image gets. It's kind of like shutter speed. Again, there's always the caveat. The secondary attribute of aperture is this. My camera is right now set to an aperture setting of 4, f4. And if you notice, my face is in focus, but my hand that's closer to the lens is out of focus. You see that? Okay. That's a result of something called depth of field. And this is the secondary attribute of your aperture. So if you want everything to be in focus, you want a higher depth of field. And to get a higher depth of field, you want the aperture to be set to a higher number, something like f11. So that's how aperture works. Now, there is this thing called bokeh. Bokeh? I don't know how to pronounce it. It's bokeh, I think. And it's the thing that they hope to achieve by buying a DSLR. Now, if you will look at the out of focus areas of this photo, you're gonna notice it's got that really nice pattern going on. You know, it's got the lights all shaped as orbs and stuff. So the out of focus areas are bokeh. Honestly speaking, most of your cameras will not be able to do this just yet. You need to have a smaller aperture. So bokeh is only a result of your depth of field being very small, allowing very little of the subject to be in focus. Last and definitely not the least, we have to talk about white balance. Now, what white balance is about is that it controls the color output of your camera or your image. And under that setting, you'll have things like cloudy, daylight, shade, tungsten. It's all different things, but they're all pre-programmed to make whites look white. As an example, this is the daylight setting. If you notice, things got really yellowish and a bit more red than usual. Shade is pretty close, but it's a bit more reddish. Cloudy is a great setting for on those overcast days. This is the fluorescent setting, and if you notice, everything seems a bit paler than it ought to, and we're back to normal. So that's how white balance affects your image. Now, obviously, you could make things look unnaturally red, unnaturally yellow, unnaturally blue using this setting. Now, mastering the effects or the results of these four is crucial to you being able to replicate or to make artistic shots. Without an understanding of aperture, you'd never be able to create a scene with beautiful bokeh. Without understanding the subtle effects of shutter speed, you would never be able to make a shot that seems frozen in time. And without understanding what or how white balance works or how it affects your image, you're never going to be able to get something that looks even remotely natural looking. Okay, so that's it for today's episode of Illumination. I hope you learned a thing or two, and it would mean a great deal to me if you hit the subscribe button up here, and if you went to my Facebook page right here and you hit that like button. And as always, I'm your host Louie, and you've just been illuminated. See you next time. Addendum: I changed or I sped up the posting schedule, so I'm not going to be posting Tuesdays and Thursdays, so that I can post a Saturday video that's more just a regular vlog and not anything structured, just me rambling for 5 minutes or so. From this day forward, I'm going to start posting Tuesdays and Thursdays. That can be a how-to video, explanation videos, FAQ videos, anything, or a review perhaps if I feel like it. And on the Saturday video, that's more of just a regular vlog, me talking lazily. Okay, so again guys, I hope you've been illuminated today, and I'll see you on Saturday.